The heavy iron gates of Sterling Manor didn't just close behind me. They slammed shut with a cold, metallic finality that signaled the official death of my childhood and the beginning of a war that my greedy Uncle Arthur was nowhere near prepared to fight. Just 3 days after my father's sudden and suspicious heart attack, I was standing on the gravel driveway in the pouring rain, watching 2 burly security guards toss my last 3 suitcases into the mud like they were nothing but bags of trash. My Uncle Arthur stood on the grand marble porch, wearing one of my father's expensive tailored suits and sipping a vintage scotch that had been in our family cellar for 40 years, looking down at me with a smirk of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Arthur had always been the black sheep of the family, a failed businessman who had spent his entire life begging my father for loans and gambling away his small inheritance in offshore casinos. But while I was away at university studying the incredibly niche and boring field of historical land archiving and cartography, Arthur had been busy like a parasite, slowly poisoning my father's mind and faking legal documents behind my back. At the reading of the will earlier that morning, the family lawyer, a man who had been on my father's payroll for decades but had clearly been bought by Arthur, read a revised document that claimed my father had left the entire $50 million estate, the private investment portfolio, and the historic Sterling lands to Arthur, leaving me with nothing but a measly $10,000 and a direct order to vacate the property immediately. I knew the document was a total forgery. My father was a man of tradition and honor. He would have never left the legacy of 4 generations to a gambling addict who couldn't even manage a lemonade stand. But Arthur had played his cards perfectly. He had physical possession of the house, he had the local sheriff in his pocket, and he had a signed piece of paper that looked real enough to hold up in a corrupt local court. As I picked up my soaked suitcases, Arthur laughed, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the mansion, and told me that I should have spent less time looking at dusty old maps and more time learning how the real world works. He told me that I was a nobody now, a broke academic with no home and no future, and that if I ever stepped foot on the Sterling grounds again, he would have me arrested for trespassing. What Arthur didn't realize, and what his greedy, small-minded brain couldn't possibly understand, was that my dusty old maps were the key to a secret that had been buried for over a century. While I was packing my things under the watchful eye of his goons, I had managed to slip a small, rotted leather tube out of my father's hidden floorboard safe in the library. Arthur thought he had cleaned out all the valuables, but he didn't know about the founder's deed. As I sat in the back of a cheap, rusted taxicab driving away from the only home I had ever known, I pulled the ancient parchment out of the tube. It was a land grant from 1895, signed by the original governor of the state. Most people would see it as a historical curiosity, but with my specialized training in land law, I saw a massive, glaring legal loophole that made every single modern deed my uncle held completely invalid. This land wasn't just a residential estate, it was designated as a perpetual sovereign trust, a legal term that had been forgotten by time. According to this 100-year-old document, the land could only be inherited by a direct blood descendant who held a professional certification in land stewardship, a certification I just happened to have finished 2 months ago. If the land was ever transferred to someone who didn't meet those specific historical criteria, the ownership didn't just stay with them. It automatically reverted to the state, and then back to the last legal steward's direct heir. Arthur thought he had stolen a $50 million fortune, but he had actually triggered a legal time bomb that was about to blow his entire life into pieces. He was currently inside my house, probably planning which luxury cars he was going to buy first, while I was headed to a small, dusty basement archive in the city to find the remaining pieces of the puzzle. I wasn't just going to sue him. I was going to use the very history he mocked to erase him from existence. The nobody he just kicked into the rain was the only person who actually knew who owned the dirt he was standing on, and I wasn't going to stop until every single brick of Sterling Manor was back in my hands and my uncle was rotting in a prison cell for fraud. The war for the Sterling estate had officially begun, and history was on my side. The smell of the State Bureau of Land Titles and Historical Records was a thick, suffocating mixture of decaying parchment, industrial floor wax, and the dry, bitter dust of 1,000 forgotten lives. But to me, It smelled like the sweetest victory I had ever tasted. I arrived at the massive gray stone building just as the sun was setting, my clothes still damp from the rain and my hands shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and pure, focused rage. I didn't head for the shiny, computerized kiosks in the lobby where the general public went to look at modern tax records. Those digital screens were useless for what I needed. Instead, I flashed my professional credentials at the security desk and headed straight for the heavy steel elevator that led to Level B FAW, the deep, climate-controlled basement archives where the original hand-drawn maps and sovereign grants from the 1800s were stored under high-security locks. The head archivist, a grumpy old man named Silas who had been a close friend of my father for 30 years, looked up from his magnifying glass as I burst through the doors. He didn't ask why I looked like a drowned rat, and he didn't ask why I was there in the middle of the night. He had already heard the rumors about my father's death and my uncle's sudden takeover of Sterling Manor. Silas didn't say a word. He just walked over to the restricted vault section, pulled out a massive, heavy wooden drawer labeled District 9, 1895, and pointed to a thick, yellowed roll of vellum that was tied with a faded red ribbon. My heart was pounding in my ears as I carefully untied the ribbon and unrolled the master survey map of 1902. This wasn't just a map. It was the allodial blueprint of our entire $50 million estate. As a certified historical land archivist, I was trained to see things that 99% of lawyers would completely miss. I leaned over the map, my eyes scanning the intricate, hand-inked calligraphy of the original surveyors. There it was, written in tiny, faded script at the very bottom corner of the deed, non-transferable under common law subject to the entailment of the Sovereign Stewardship Act of 1892. I felt a chill run down my spine. Most modern property law in the USA is based on fee simple ownership, which means you can sell it or leave it in a will to whoever you want. But the Sterling lands were different. My great-great-grandfather was a genius who hated the idea of the family fortune being gambled away by a future idiot, someone exactly like my Uncle Arthur. He had registered the land under a sovereign stewardship clause that effectively separated the use of the land from the ownership of the land. In simple terms, Arthur's revised will was a useless piece of paper because the land itself wasn't actually part of my father's personal estate. It was held in a permanent trust that could only be managed by a qualified steward, someone with the specific professional certifications that I had just earned. According to the 100-year-old law, the moment Arthur tried to claim the land as his personal property and change the locks, he had technically committed sovereign trespass. While I was staring at this incredible legal evidence, my phone buzzed with a notification from the security app I had secretly left running on my laptop back at the mansion. I opened the feed and felt my blood boil. Arthur wasn't just sleeping in my father's bed. He was throwing a massive, loud, obnoxious party. I watched through the hidden cameras as he walked around the grand ballroom with a group of his shady, low-life gambling buddies, laughing as they touched the rare statues and spilled red wine on the antique Persian rugs. I saw two men in cheap suits carrying out my father's priceless collection of 18th-century French clocks, loading them into the back of a van. Arthur was selling off the family heirlooms to pay back his massive gambling debts before the ink on the fake will was even dry. He was treating Sterling Manor like a pawn shop, stripping the walls of everything that made it a home. He thought he had a few months of legal battles before I could even file a lawsuit. But he didn't realize that I wasn't playing the game by the modern rules. I turned to Silas and asked him if the original registry of stewards was still active. Silas smiled a slow, toothless grin, reached under his desk, and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book with a brass lock. He told me that since the law had never been officially repealed, it was still the supreme law of the district. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously scanning every page of the 1895 land grant and the 1902 master survey, creating a high-resolution digital file that would serve as my primary weapon. I also drafted an automatic reversion notice, a rare and terrifying legal document that doesn't just ask for a court hearing. It immediately freezes the title of the land and authorizes a physical repossession if the stewardship requirements are not met. As the sun began to rise over the city, I realized I had everything I needed. I had the law, I had the maps, and I had the proof that my uncle was a common thief. I walked out of the archives, the cold morning air hitting my face, and headed straight to the one person who could help me execute the final phase of the plan. A retired Supreme Court justice who specialized in ancient land tenure and who owed my father a massive life debt. Arthur thought he was the king of the hill, but he was actually standing on a trapdoor that I was about to pull wide open. He had no idea that by the time he woke up from his drunken party, his ownership of Sterling Manor would be legally non-existent. I wasn't just coming back for my house. I was coming back to erase him from the family tree, and I was going to use every single dusty map and 100-year-old loophole to make sure he never saw a single penny of my father's fortune ever again. The second part of the war was over, and now it was time for the first shot to be fired. The office of retired Supreme Court Justice Elias Thorne felt like a sacred temple built from the spirits of 1,000 leather-bound law books and the cold, hard logic of a century of legal battles. As I sat in the high-backed velvet chair across from the man who had once been the most feared legal mind in the entire country, I realized that I wasn't just there for advice. I was there to hand him the match that would burn my uncle's stolen kingdom to the ground. Justice Thorne was nearly 90 years old, with eyes like sharpened steel and a voice that sounded like heavy stones grinding together. But the moment I laid the 1895 sovereign land grant on his mahogany desk, I saw a spark of genuine, predatory excitement in his gaze that I knew Arthur should be absolutely terrified of. Thorne didn't just read the document. He dissected it with the precision of a surgeon, his long, thin fingers tracing the ancient ink as I explained the sovereign stewardship loophole I had uncovered in the basement archives. I told him how Arthur had forged a modern will to claim the $50 million estate, but how the original allodial title of the land was governed by an unbreakable, 100-year-old, blood and certification clause that Arthur's greedy brain couldn't even comprehend. Thorne let out a dry, rattling laugh that sent a chill through the room, telling me that in all his decades on the bench, he had never seen a more perfect example of a legal ghost trap. He explained that because the Sterling lands were never legally incorporated into the modern municipal grid, they existed in a rare, gray zone of property law where ancient stewardship trumped modern probate. In simple terms, Arthur hadn't just stolen a house. He had technically declared war on the state's original land registry, and the state does not like being ignored. While Thorne's elite team of private paralegals began drafting the Notice of Immediate Reversion, I pulled up the secret remote feed of Sterling Manor on my tablet and felt my jaw clench in pure disgust. It was 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, and my father's beautiful, quiet home had been turned into a scene from a low-budget gangster movie. Uncle Arthur was sitting at the head of the antique dining table, surrounded by 3 shady men in cheap, shiny suits who I recognized as high-interest loan sharks from the city's underground gambling dens. They were laughing and eating off my mother's fine bone china, while Arthur signed away the rights to my father's vintage car collection as collateral for a new, massive loan to cover his existing gambling debts. He was literally selling the skin off my family's back before the funeral flowers had even wilted. I looked back at Justice Thorne and told him it was time to pull the trigger. I didn't want a long, drawn-out court case that would take years to resolve. I wanted an immediate, high-impact strike that would freeze Arthur's life in its tracks. Thorne nodded, picked up his ancient fountain pen, and signed the Order of Stewardship Verification. This wasn't a standard lawsuit. It was a sovereign mandate that required the current occupant of the land to prove their professional certification as a land steward within 24 hours or face immediate physical removal by the state marshal's office. I took the signed documents, thanked the justice, and headed straight to a high-end private security firm that specialized in high-risk legal serving. I didn't want a regular mailman to deliver this news. I wanted a team of professionals who would make sure Arthur understood that his party was officially over. Exactly 2 hours later, while Arthur was in the middle of showing his lone shark buddies the hidden wine cellar, a massive, black-armored SUV pulled up to the front gates of Sterling Manor. The security guards Arthur had hired tried to block the entrance, but the lead server, a former military police officer with a voice like a foghorn, stepped out and presented a state warrant for title verification. Because the land was currently in reversion status, the campus security Arthur had hired had no legal authority to stop them. They marched up the grand marble staircase, kicked open the massive oak doors, and walked right into the dining room where Arthur was just about to pour another glass of father's expensive scotch. The look on Arthur's face when the lead server slapped the thick, heavy legal packet onto the table, splashing scotch all over his forged will, was a moment of pure, divine justice. The server didn't say a word. He just pointed to the timestamp at the bottom of the page, which showed that Arthur had exactly 23 hours and 59 minutes to produce a master of land archiving, certificate, or lose access to every single dollar associated with the property. Arthur started screaming, his face turning a dark, bruised shade of purple, claiming that he owned the house and that he would have everyone arrested. But then, his phone started blowing up with a barrage of urgent notifications that made him go completely pale. Because the order of reversion had been filed directly with the central bank's fraud department, every single account tied to the Sterling estate, the accounts Arthur thought he had just inherited, was instantly and permanently frozen. The credit cards he had just used to buy $10,000 worth of designer clothes and expensive cigars were now useless pieces of plastic. The loan sharks sitting at his table immediately realized the money they were promised didn't exist anymore, and their friendly smiles turned into cold, predatory glares. Arthur looked around his stolen dining room, realized he was surrounded by angry criminals and a legal document he couldn't even read, and finally felt the first cold breath of the ghost I had released from the archives. He thought he was the king of the Sterling legacy, but he was really just a squatter in a house that belonged to a master steward, and the clock was ticking down to his absolute destruction. I was sitting in a quiet cafe down the street, watching the entire panic unfold through my tablet, and I took a slow, satisfying sip of my coffee. The match had been lit, the bridge was burning, and my greedy uncle had nowhere to run. The nobody nephew was officially back in the game, and I was coming for every single brick of my father's empire. The silence that followed the departure of the legal servers from the grand dining hall of Sterling Manor wasn't the peaceful quiet of a country estate. It was the suffocating, heavy silence that happens right before a massive building collapses into a pile of rubble. I watched through the hidden high-definition pinhole cameras I had installed in the crown molding months ago, during my father's final weeks, when I already suspected Arthur was poisoning the atmosphere, and the view was absolutely cinematic. Uncle Arthur was standing frozen at the head of the long mahogany table, his face a ghostly, mottled shade of gray and purple. Staring at the splash of vintage scotch that was slowly soaking into the forged will he had pinned his entire future on. The three loan sharks, men with thick necks, cold eyes, and knuckles that had clearly broken more than a few debts, didn't look like guests anymore. They looked like predators who had just realized their prey had lead in its blood. The leader of the group, a massive man named Bruno who was wearing a suit that cost more than a mid-sized car, slowly stood up, his chair scraping against the antique hardwood floor with a sound that sounded like a scream. Bruno didn't yell. He just leaned over the table, his shadow looming over my trembling uncle, and told him in a low, terrifying growl that the $10 million collateral Arthur had promised for his gambling debts was now a legal ghost. He reminded Arthur that they didn't care about sovereign stewardship or 100-year-old maps. They only cared about the green cash they were promised by noon. Arthur tried to stammer, his voice cracking like dry wood, claiming that his lawyers would fix everything and that the notice of reversion was just a technical glitch. He reached for his gold-plated smartphone to call his private banker, but as his thumbs swiped across the screen, he realized the ultimate horror of my digital strike. Because Justice Thorne had filed the sovereign mandate directly into the federal banking backbone, Arthur's entire digital identity had been put into a financial quarantine. Every time he tried to open his banking app, a giant red banner appeared on the screen that read, "Account seized by state marshal title dispute in progress." He couldn't even use the phone to order a pizza, let alone move millions of dollars to pay off a group of angry criminals. Bruno reached out, grabbed Arthur by the expensive silk tie my father had bought for his 60th birthday, and pulled him across the table until their noses were inches apart, telling him that if the accounts weren't unfrozen by sunset, They wouldn't be taking the furniture. They would be taking his fingers. While the chaos was erupting in the dining room, I was sitting in my mobile command center, a high-tech van parked 3 miles away in a public library parking lot, surrounded by 4 glowing monitors and enough processing power to hijack a small city's power grid. I wasn't just watching the cameras. I was systematically dismantling the secondary layers of Arthur's life. I had already bypassed the security firewalls of the law firm he had hired to forge the will, and I was currently watching their senior partner, a corrupt man named Miller, frantically deleting files in a blind panic. Miller had realized that Justice Thorne's name was on the mandate, and in the legal world, fighting Thorne is like trying to stop a hurricane with a paper shield. I waited until Miller highlighted the original forgery draft, and then I struck, using a remote access Trojan to freeze his computer and send a master copy of the entire folder directly to the state attorney's office and my own encrypted cloud server. I watched Miller's face through his own webcam as he realized his career was over in a single click. Back at the manor, the 24-hour clock was ticking down with brutal efficiency. Arthur had exactly 20 hours left to produce a Master of Land Stewardship certificate, something that required 4 years of specialized doctoral study and a state-issued license that only 3 people in the entire country held, and I was the youngest of them. Arthur desperately called every high-priced legal fixer in the city, but the moment they heard the words Sovereign Trust and Elias Thorne, they hung up the phone faster than a lightning strike. No one was coming to save him. By mid-afternoon, the situation inside the house had turned into a full-blown nightmare. The loan sharks had started inventorying the house to make sure nothing was smuggled out. I watched as they walked through my mother's private gallery, ripping paintings off the walls and stacking them like cordwood in the hallway. They didn't care about art or history, they only saw dollar signs. Arthur was reduced to a crying mess, following them around and begging them not to touch the antiques, but they just laughed and shoved him aside. I felt a momentary pang of sadness for the house, but then I remembered the way Arthur had stood on that porch and watched me get kicked out into the rain, and my heart turned back into cold, hard stone. I had spent my entire life being the quiet academic, the kid who was too busy with old books to care about real power, and now that very knowledge was the only thing standing between the sterling legacy and total destruction. Arthur thought power was about who had the most money right now, but I knew that true power was about who owned the meaning of the land. At 6:00 p.m., exactly 18 hours before the deadline, Arthur made his biggest mistake yet. He decided to try and sneak out of the house through the old servants' tunnel, carrying a heavy leather duffel bag stuffed with my father's rare coin collection and several bars of solid gold he had found in the library safe. He thought he was being clever, moving through the dark, damp stone tunnels that most people had forgotten existed. But he forgot that I had spent my childhood playing in those tunnels and that I had mapped every single inch of them for my doctoral thesis. I waited until he reached the heavy iron grate at the end of the tunnel, gasping for breath and covered in spiderwebs, and then I used the manor's automated gate system to lock the exterior latch remotely. Arthur slammed into the gate, the gold coins spilling out of his bag and clattering onto the stone floor, realized he was trapped in a dark, cold hole with no way out and no one to hear his screams. I leaned into my microphone and whispered into the tunnel's intercom system, my voice sounding like a ghostly echo from the walls. I told him that the land itself was rejecting him, that the sterling soil knew he was a thief, and that the 100-year-old law he laughed at was currently the only thing keeping him from being torn apart by the lone sharks waiting for him back in the dining room. I watched through the night vision camera as he fell to his knees, sobbing and begging the walls for forgiveness, but the walls didn't answer. I gave him exactly 1 hour of total darkness and isolation to think about what he had done before I remotely unlocked the inner door, forcing him to crawl back into the house where his creditors were waiting with even more questions. He was a broken man, a hollow shell of the arrogant uncle who had kicked me out, and the real reckoning hadn't even truly begun yet. The final 12 hours of the countdown were approaching, and the state marshal was already fueled up and ready to move. Arthur had no money, no lawyer, no certification, and now, no hope. I closed my laptop, took a deep breath of the cool night air, and prepared for the final morning. The nobody nephew was about to walk back through those gates, And this time, I wasn't leaving until the sterling name was cleansed of every trace of Arthur's filth. The 24-hour implosion was almost complete, and the explosion was going to be beautiful. The final sunrise over the Sterling estate arrived with a cold, pale light that seemed to strip away the last remaining layers of my Uncle Arthur's fake dignity, revealing the trembling, hollow coward that had been hiding underneath my father's expensive suits for his entire life. As the red digital numbers on my dashboard clock hit exactly 8:00 a.m., the 24-hour Notice of Stewardship Verification officially expired. And in that exact millisecond, the legal status of the $50 million land shifted from a disputed inheritance to an active sovereign reclamation. I watched through the long-range thermal optics of my surveillance van as 3 massive, blacked-out SUVs with official state seals on the doors crested the hill and accelerated toward the grand iron gates of the manor. Leading the convoy was State Marshal Vance, a man who had built a 30-year reputation for being the most uncompromising enforcer of land law in the country, and he wasn't alone. Sitting in the back of the lead vehicle was the legal representative from Justice Thorne's office, carrying the original 1895 sovereign land grant in a high-security briefcase. I put on my father's old leather jacket, gripped my official Master of Land Stewardship certification in my hand, and followed the convoy in my own vehicle, feeling a surge of cold, focused energy that I had never felt in my life. As we reached the gates, the security goons Arthur had hired tried to stand their ground, but one look at the marshal's federal warrant and the heavy tactical gear of his team made them drop their radios and step aside like the paid cowards they were. We drove up the long, winding gravel driveway, passing the beautiful oak trees my grandfather had planted, and pulled up to the front of the mansion just as the massive oak doors swung open. Uncle Arthur stumbled out onto the porch, looking like a man who hadn't slept in a decade. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair was a wild mess, and his expensive silk shirt was stained with the sweat of a man who knew he was finally out of time. Behind him, the 3 loan sharks were standing in the shadows of the foyer, looking nervous because even they knew that fighting the state marshal was a death sentence for their illegal business. Arthur tried to start his usual routine, screaming about his legal right to the property and waving his forged will in the air like a weapon, but Marshal Vance didn't even slow down. He marched up the stairs, his boots echoing with a sound like thunder, and told Arthur to shut his mouth before he was charged with felony obstruction of justice. The marshal turned to the legal representative, who opened the briefcase and pulled out the 100-year-old founder's deed that I had recovered from the archives. The scene was absolutely perfect. The marshal began reading the Sovereign Reversion Mandate at maximum volume, his voice carrying across the entire front lawn so every gardener, maid, and security guard could hear the truth. He explained that because the current occupant, Arthur Sterling, had failed to produce a valid Master of Land Stewardship certification within the 24-hour window, the modern deed and the forged will were now legally voided by sovereign right. He explained that under the 1895 land grant, the property didn't belong to the estate anymore. It had reverted back to the bloodline of the last verified steward. That was the moment I stepped out of my car. I walked slowly up the stairs, the morning wind whipping around me, and stood directly in front of my uncle. I didn't say a word. I just held up my gold-embossed stewardship certification, the one I had earned through years of grueling study that he had mocked. The look on Arthur's face when he saw that document was the most satisfying thing I have ever experienced. He realized that the nobody nephew hadn't just been studying history. I had been studying the exact mechanism of his own destruction. The marshal took my certification, compared the seal to the 1895 deed, and then turned back to Arthur with a look of cold finality. He told Arthur that he had exactly 15 minutes to gather any personal belongings, meaning items he had actually purchased with his own money, and get off the property for good. If he touched a single piece of my father's furniture or a single antique, he would be arrested on the spot for grand larceny of a sovereign trust. The loan sharks, seeing that the game was truly over and that there was no money left to steal, tried to slip out the back door, but the marshal's tactical team was already waiting for them. They were handcuffed and led away in silence, their predatory power evaporated by the sheer weight of the law. Arthur started to break down, falling to his knees and crying, begging me to remember that we were family and that he was just trying to protect the legacy in his own way. I looked down at him, the same way he had looked down at me when he kicked me out in the rain, and I told him that family doesn't forge wills and family doesn't sell off their brother's memories to pay for gambling debts. I told him that as far as the Sterling bloodline was concerned, he was no longer a member. I had already filed the paperwork with the family historian to have his name officially struck from the lineage for stewardship malfeasance. While the marshal's men started physically escorting Arthur toward a waiting patrol car, I turned to the senior partner of the law firm Arthur had used to forge the will. He had arrived just a few minutes later, thinking he could still talk his way out of the disaster, but I had a special surprise for him too. I handed the marshal the digital logs I had recovered from the lawyer's own server, showing the exact time and date they had edited the fake will. The lawyer went as white as a sheet, realized that he wasn't just losing a client, he was losing his license and his freedom. As they were all driven away in a convoy of flashing lights and sirens, a deep, heavy silence finally returned to Sterling Manor. It was the first time the house had felt truly peaceful since my father's passing. I walked back through the grand oak doors, the heavy keys to the manor now resting firmly in my hand. I walked into the library, looked at the empty spot on the wall where Arthur had tried to steal a painting, and I felt my father's spirit finally at rest. The land had rejected the thief, and the steward had returned. I sat down at my father's desk, opened my laptop, and began the process of undoing every single transaction Arthur had made in the last week. Every loan, every contract, and every lie was being erased. I wasn't just back in my home. I was the sovereign master of my own destiny, and I was going to make sure that the Sterling name was never dragged through the mud again. The war was over, the loophole had worked, and the nobody nephew had just become the most powerful landowner in the state. I looked out the window at the rising sun and realized that history doesn't just repeat itself. It protects those who are brave enough to remember it. The heavy silence that settled over Sterling Manor after the state marshal's sirens faded into the distance wasn't a hollow quiet. It was the sound of a house finally breathing again after being choked by a parasite for the last 2 weeks. I stood in the middle of the grand foyer, the morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, and looked at the devastation my Uncle Arthur had left behind. There were cigarette burns on the antique silk wallpaper, wine stains on the hand-woven Persian rugs, and empty frames on the walls where priceless family history once hung. But I didn't feel overwhelmed, and I didn't feel defeated, because as a master of land stewardship, I knew that every single stone, every single document, and every single brick had a memory that Arthur's greed could never truly erase. I spent the first 6 hours of my return sitting in the main server room in the basement, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I initiated the asset tracking protocol. Arthur thought that because he had sold my father's rare coin collection and the 18th century French clocks to shady underground dealers, they were gone forever. But he forgot that I had personally cataloged every item in this house with high-resolution digital watermarks and embedded GPS micro-trackers years ago. Using the manor's dedicated satellite uplink, I watched as dozens of red pings started appearing on a digital map of the city. I saw the exact pawn shops and illegal warehouses where the loan sharks had hidden my family's history. I didn't call the regular police. I called the State Bureau of Antiquities and the Federal Art Theft Task Force, sending them the exact coordinates and the sovereign reversion warrants I had pre-drafted. Within 3 hours, I was watching live police bodycam feeds as my father's belongings were being seized from the criminals Arthur had sold them to. Every single item was being returned to the manor in climate-controlled trucks, and for every item found, a new felony charge of receiving stolen sovereign property was being added to Arthur's legal file. By mid-afternoon, I decided it was time to visit the man himself. I drove down to the county jail, walked through the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways, and sat behind the thick glass partition in the high-security visiting area. When the guards led Arthur out, he looked like a broken ghost. He was wearing a rough, orange jumpsuit that was 3 sizes too big, his hands were trembling, and his face was bruised from where the loan sharks had reminded him of his debts before the police arrived. The moment he saw me, He started crying, pressing his hands against the glass and begging me to drop the charges, claiming that he would do anything to make it right. I just looked at him with a cold, detached expression, the same way a doctor looks at a malignant tumor they've just removed. I told him that I wasn't there to listen to his lies. I was there to show him the finality of his failure. I held up my tablet and showed him the news headlines. His law firm had been shut down, his gambling associates were in custody, and the forged will had been ceremonially shredded by the state attorney. I told him that because of the sovereign malfeasance clause, he was being sued for every penny he had ever made in his entire life to pay for the restoration of the estate. He wasn't just going to prison, he was going to die in a cage without a single cent to his name. The look of total, absolute despair in his eyes was the final payment for the tears my father had shed in his final days. After leaving the jail, I returned to the manor and headed straight for the one place Arthur had never been able to find, the hidden archive behind the library's main fireplace. I used my specialized knowledge of the house's 19th century architecture to trigger the counterweight mechanism, and the stone wall slid open with a low, grinding sound. Inside, I found a small, temperature-controlled vault that contained my father's true legacy. There were no gold bars or stacks of cash. Instead, there was a single, handwritten letter addressed to me, dated just 1 week before he died. As I read the words, tears finally began to stream down my face. My father had known. He had known that Arthur was a snake, and he had known that the only way to protect the sterling land was to train me in the most obscure, powerful form of law imaginable. He had intentionally encouraged me to become a land archivist because he knew that one day I would need to use history as a weapon. He told me in the letter that the $50 million was just paper, but the stewardship of the land was a sacred duty that spanned generations. He had even left me the original blueprints for a sovereign foundation, a plan to turn the estate into a global research center for historical land rights, ensuring that no other family could ever be destroyed by a greedy relative using modern legal loopholes. I spent the rest of the evening sitting on the porch, watching the stars come out over the sterling lands, feeling the weight of the past and the promise of the future. I had dismantled a billion-dollar conspiracy with 100-year-old maps. I had put a criminal uncle behind bars, and I had reclaimed my family's soul. The nobody nephew was now the guardian of a legacy that would outlive us all. As the last of the restoration trucks pulled away, and the manor was finally quiet once again, I realized that the story of the Sterling estate wasn't just about revenge. It was about the absolute, unbreakable power of the truth. I closed my laptop, walked into the foyer, and locked the grand oak doors for the final time that day. I wasn't just home. I was the sovereign master of my own destiny, and the war was officially, victoriously over. I thought the war was over the moment I watched Uncle Arthur's pathetic, orange-clad figure disappear behind the steel doors of the county jail. But as I stood on the balcony of Sterling Manor watching the sunset, a fleet of 6 identical black luxury SUVs pulled into my driveway with a coordinated precision that screamed corporate warfare. This wasn't the messy, desperate greed of a gambling uncle. This was the cold, calculated aggression of Titan Peak Developments, the most ruthless real estate conglomerate in the country. I watched through my high-powered binoculars as a man in a 3-piece suit that cost more than a mid-sized car stepped out of the lead vehicle. It was Marcus Thon, the CEO of Titan Peak, and the man who had been secretly funding Arthur's legal fees and gambling debts in exchange for a private promise to turn the Sterling estate into a billion-dollar casino resort. Arthur was just the Trojan horse, and now that he was gone, the real monsters were coming out of the shadows to claim the prize. Thon didn't wait for an invitation. He walked up the marble stairs of my porch with an army of corporate lawyers and a man I recognized from the evening news, State Senator William Graves. Before I could even open the door, Thon slapped a thick, red-stamped folder against the glass. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was an emergency eminent domain filing. Graves, using his corrupt political influence, had signed a secret executive order declaring the Sterling land as critical infrastructure territory for a new state highway project that conveniently happened to run right through the middle of my family's 100-year-old forest. They weren't just trying to buy the land anymore. They were using the power of the government to steal it for pennies on the dollar. I opened the door, standing my ground with a cold, calm fury that seemed to catch Thon off guard. He looked me up and down, mocking my leather jacket and my worthless archive books, and told me that my sovereign stewardship meant nothing in the face of state progress. He offered me a measly $5 million to walk away quietly, telling me that if I fought them, the senator would make sure I was tied up in court until I was 80 years old and completely broke. I looked at Senator Graves, a man who had built his entire career on the image of family values, and I realized that he was just as dirty as the mud on my boots. I didn't take the money, and I didn't show them a single second of fear. I simply told them that they were standing on sovereign soil and that they had exactly 60 seconds to get off my driveway before I released the allodial counterstrike. Thon laughed, calling me a delusional academic, and they drove away in a cloud of expensive exhaust, convinced that they had already won. But they forgot that as a master of land stewardship, I didn't just know the history of the surface, I knew the history of the ghost maps. I spent the next 24 hours locked in the manor's library, surrounding myself with maps from the late 1800s that weren't even listed in the public library system. I was looking for the environmental anchor, the one thing that no highway project and no corrupt senator could ever legally touch. My fingers were stained with ink and my eyes were burning from the blue light of my monitors as I cross-referenced the 1895 land grant with the Sovereign Hydrology Act of 1899. And then, at 4:00 a.m., I found the silver bullet. Underneath the very spot where Thon wanted to build his casino, there was an ancient, subterranean aquifer system that had been designated as a permanent sovereign water source for the entire district over a century ago. According to the original charter, any construction within 3 miles of that aquifer was a capital crime against the state because it threatened the primary water supply of the local farming communities. But there was something even bigger. Deep in the 1902 Geological Survey, I found proof that the Sterling land wasn't just a trust. It was a sovereign wildlife sanctuary for a species of rare white owls that were thought to be extinct, but were actually still nesting in our old-growth oaks. I realized that Senator Graves hadn't just signed a highway order. He had signed his own political death warrant. He had violated federal environmental protection laws that were built into the very foundation of the state's constitution. I didn't call Thon, and I didn't call the senator. Instead, I spent the morning creating a massive, high-definition digital presentation that combined the ancient maps with modern satellite infrared scans that proved the existence of the aquifer and the nesting grounds. I also used my digital archive access to track the dark money trail between Titan Peak developments and the senator's secret campaign accounts. It turned out Thon had donated $10 million to a fake charity owned by the senator's wife just 3 days before the highway order was signed. It was the most blatant, disgusting case of bribery in the history of the state. I waited until the following morning, when the senator and Thon were holding a massive, televised, groundbreaking ceremony on the edge of my property, surrounded by news cameras and local supporters. They were wearing hard hats and holding golden shovels, laughing and bragging about the new progress they were bringing to the district. I walked right into the middle of the live television broadcast, wearing my master stewardship insignia, and handed a copy of the sovereign injunction to the lead news reporter from the biggest network in the state. I didn't just stop the ceremony, I hijacked the entire narrative. I pointed to the infrared monitors I had set up on the back of my van, showing the hidden aquifer and the corruption files for the entire world to see. The look of pure, agonizing terror on Senator Graves' face when he realized his bribe had been exposed on live TV was better than any paycheck. Thon tried to have his security guards tackle me, but the crowd of local farmers, the people whose water supply he was about to poison, stepped in front of me, forming a human wall of protection. They realized that the academic wasn't their enemy. I was the only one fighting for their future. Within minutes, the federal environmental agents I had alerted arrived on the scene, shutting down the entire project and placing Thon and Graves under immediate investigation for federal conspiracy and bribery. Thon stood there in the dirt, his golden shovel dropped in the mud. Realized that his billion-dollar corporation was now facing a total bankruptcy and a criminal trial that would destroy his life. I looked him in the eyes and told him that state progress doesn't mean stealing from the past to line your own pockets. I told him that history was a living thing, and today it had decided to bury him. As the news helicopters circled overhead and the corrupt senator was led away in handcuffs, I realized that the Sterling land was finally, truly safe. I had used the ghost maps to win the war, and the nobody nephew was now a hero to the entire community. I walked back to my manor, the heavy iron gates locking behind me, and I finally felt the weight of the war lift off my chest. The corporate monsters were gone, the land was protected, and the sovereign steward was the only one left standing. The arrest of Marcus Thawne and the public disgrace of Senator Graves on live television was the loudest explosion the state had heard in decades. But as I sat in the high-tech security hub I had built into my father's old study, I realized that the real monsters were only just starting to wake up in their ivory towers. You see, a billion-dollar development firm like Titan Peak doesn't act alone. They are the attack dogs for a group known in the legal underground as the Silver Hand, a secret syndicate of 5 trillionaire families who have controlled every inch of the state's land since the Industrial Revolution. By exposing the aquifer and the bribe, I hadn't just stopped a resort. I had threatened a 50-year-old money laundering network that used historic estates as black sites for their illegal offshore transactions. On Friday night, exactly 48 hours after the groundbreaking ceremony failed, the silence of the Sterling Woods was shattered by the low, predatory hum of 3 blacked-out military-grade helicopters hovering just outside the manor's radar-dead zones. I watched through my thermal perimeter sensors as 12 high-end corporate fixes, mercenaries hired by the syndicate to do their dirty work, dropped from the sky and began moving toward the house with a precision that told me they weren't here to talk or serve papers. They were here to burn the manor to the ground and erase every single map, file, and witness inside. But they forgot the most important rule of land stewardship. A master steward doesn't just own the land, he is the land. I didn't panic, and I didn't call the local police, because I knew the syndicate had already cut the phone lines and jammed the cellular towers for 5 miles in every direction. I simply tapped a hidden sequence on my father's antique brass desk clock, and the Sovereign Defense Protocol, a series of mechanical and digital traps built into the very foundation of the 1895 structure, was instantly engaged. As the first team of mercenaries reached the grand oak doors and tried to plant a thermal charge, the heavy stone gargoyles on the roof shifted, triggered by pressure plates in the driveway, and released a high-pressure cloud of specialized fire-suppressant foam that not only neutralized their explosives, but also coated them in a chemical luminescent dye that made them glow bright neon green on my night vision monitors. I watched them scramble in a blind panic as the nobody, nephew they thought was a defenseless academic, began systematically picking them apart using the house itself as a weapon. Using my knowledge of the manor's original 19th century blueprints, I triggered the internal hydraulic system that rotated the library's heavy bookshelves, creating a maze that trapped 3 of the goons in a windowless room with no exit. I spoke to them through the hidden intercom system, my voice calm and cold, telling them that they were currently in a sovereign holding cell under the Land Act of 1892, and that every second they remained on the property, their legal status was shifting from trespassers to enemies of the state trust. While the ground team was struggling with the manor's physical defenses, I was busy on my main terminal, launching a counter-hack against the syndicate's private cloud server. I had traced the encrypted signal coming from the helicopters back to a secret data center in Switzerland owned by the Silver Hand. Using the digital backdoor I had discovered in Marcus Thawne's files, I began a massive, high-speed data siphon, pulling every single illegal contract, every fake offshore account, and every record of the syndicate's land grabs from the last 50 years directly onto my secure drives. I was literally stealing the collective secrets of the most powerful people in the world, while their hired guns were trying to break down my kitchen door. One of the mercenaries, a man who looked like he had seen 100 wars, finally managed to break through a secondary servant's entrance, but he didn't find me waiting there. Instead, he found himself standing on a disguised trapdoor that led directly into the manor's original 1890s ice storage vault, a 30-foot deep stone pit with no ladder and no handholds. I looked down at him through the internal camera feed and told him that his employers had sent him to die for a cause that was already lost. By 3:00 a.m., the Sovereign siege had turned into a total disaster for the syndicate. 8 of their 12 men were trapped in various parts of the house, and the remaining 4 were pinned down on the front lawn by the manor's automated high-intensity floodlights that were blinding them with 50,000 lumens of pure white light. That was the moment I initiated the final phase of the allodial counterstrike. I didn't send the stolen data to the local news. I sent it to the International Criminal Court and the Federal Treasury's Anti-Money Laundering Division, along with a live GPS link to the helicopters currently hovering over my house. I also triggered the manor's original steam-powered emergency siren, a sound so loud it could be heard in the next 3 counties, waking up every farmer and local citizen within 20 miles. The Silver Hand thrived on secrecy, but I was making so much noise that the entire world was looking at Sterling Manor. Within 20 minutes, the sound of the syndicate's helicopters was drowned out by the roar of state police and federal aviation interceptors. The mercenaries realized the game was over, dropped their weapons, and surrendered to the authorities as the black SUVs of the FBI started rolling up the driveway. I walked out onto the grand porch, my father's leather jacket over my shoulders and my tablet in my hand, as the sun began to rise over the smoking ruins of the syndicate's pride. Marcus Thon's bosses were currently being arrested in their penthouses across the globe. Their bank accounts were being frozen by international mandates, and the nobody, nephew, was still standing on the soil that had belonged to his family for a century. I looked out at the beautiful Sterling forest, knowing that the rare white owls were still safe in their nests, and the aquifer was still pure beneath the ground. I had defended the land not with guns or money, but with the absolute power of the truth and the hidden secrets of the archives. As the feds began processing the scene, the lead agent walked up to me, looked at the chaos I had created with a few old maps and a laptop, and asked me how I managed to survive a professional hit squad. I just smiled and told him that you should never underestimate a man who knows exactly what's buried under your feet. The war for the Sterling estate wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for the very idea of justice. I walked back into my house, closed the grand oak doors, and finally felt the spirit of my father telling me that the stewardship was complete. The Sterling name was now synonymous with unbreakable integrity, and the Silver Hand was nothing but a memory. The Sovereign Master had won the final battle, and the land was finally at peace. The dust from the federal raid on Sterling Manor had barely settled when the real final boss of this century-long war decided to step out from behind the velvet curtains of the global banking elite. On Monday morning, exactly 3 days after I had successfully defended my father's land from a professional hit squad, a single, unassuming silver sedan pulled up to the main gates of the estate. There were no flashing lights, no armored SUVs, and no shouting, just a man in a gray suit who looked more like a librarian than a billionaire. This was Julian Vane, the chief legal architect for the Silver Hand, and the man who managed the secret fortunes of the world's most powerful land grabbers. I met him on the grand porch, standing exactly where my Uncle Arthur had stood when he tried to ruin my life, but this time, the power dynamic had completely shifted. Vane didn't threaten me, and he didn't mention the mercenaries I had trapped in my basement. Instead, he opened a sleek carbon fiber briefcase and laid out a single piece of paper that made my heart skip a beat. It was a digital bank transfer authorization for exactly $1 billion, tax-free, deposited into any offshore account of my choosing. Vane looked me in the eyes with a terrifying, robotic calmness and told me that the Silver Hand didn't care about Arthur, Marcus Thorne, or even the Sterling Manor anymore. They only cared about the master archive I had siphoned from their Swiss servers during the siege. He told me that for $1 billion, I could delete the data, sign a lifetime non-disclosure agreement, and disappear to a private island where no one would ever find me. He reminded me that I was just one man sitting on a pile of old maps, and that the people he represented had enough money to buy the history books I loved so much. I looked at that number, $1 billion, and I realized that this was the exact moment where most people would have broken. With that kind of money, I could rebuild my father's legacy 10 times over. But as a master of land stewardship, I knew something that Julian Vane's cold, calculated brain couldn't process. I knew that land isn't just an asset you buy and sell. It is the physical memory of a people, and once you sell that memory, you lose your soul. I didn't take the pen, and I didn't look at the check. Instead, I pulled out my own tablet and showed Vane a live stream of the state capitol's main courtyard. I told him that while he was driving to my house, I had already initiated a sovereign public release protocol. Because the Sterling land was a sovereign trust, I had the legal authority to declare any data recovered on that land as public domain if it revealed a threat to the state's integrity. I had already sent the decryption keys for the syndicate's dark money files to every major investigative journalist in the USA, Australia, and the UK. The $1 billion he was offering me was now nothing but a record of a bribe attempt, because I had been recording our entire conversation through the manor's high-fidelity exterior microphones. The look of pure, agonizing shock on Julian Vane's face, a man who had never lost a negotiation in 40 years, was worth more than any billion-dollar check. He realized that the nobody archivist hadn't just beaten his hit squad. I had destroyed the very foundation of the syndicate's secrecy. He turned around without saying a single word, got back into his silver sedan, and drove away as fast as the engine would allow, knowing that within the hour, every federal agency on the planet would be kicking down the doors of his employers. With the syndicate finally in a blind panic, I turned my attention to the final piece of the puzzle, the public trial of Uncle Arthur. I drove to the city's central courthouse, where a massive crowd of locals had gathered to watch the man who tried to steal their water and their history finally face the music. I walked into that courtroom, and as I took the witness stand, the room went dead silent. Arthur was sitting at the defense table, looking like a shriveled, broken old man, his lawyers desperately trying to argue that he was a victim of corporate manipulation. But I didn't give them a single inch of ground. I presented the founder's deed from 1895, the forged will from last month, and the secret recordings of Arthur laughing about my father's death. I showed the jury the digital trail of his gambling debts and the cold, hard proof that he had sold my family's soul for a few months of fake luxury. The jury didn't even need an hour to reach a verdict. Arthur was found guilty on all counts, including sovereign fraud, conspiracy to commit arson, and grand larceny. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and the judge ordered that every single asset he had ever touched be forfeited to the Sterling Sovereign Trust. As he was led away in chains, screaming that he was the rightful heir, I realized that the Sterling name was finally, truly cleansed. But my work didn't stop there. I used the remaining funds from the trust to officially transform Sterling Manor from a private residence into the Sterling Global Institute of Land Sovereignty. I hired SEALs from the archives and a team of the brightest young legal minds in the country to begin the process of auditing every major land grab in the state's history. We weren't just protecting one house anymore. We were protecting the very idea of ownership for the common person. 5 years later, I stood on that same balcony where Arthur had once mocked me, looking out at the thriving community below. The rare white owls were flourishing in the old-growth oaks. The aquifer was providing pure water to thousands of local farms, and the manor was now a world-class research center that helped people all over the globe fight back against corporate greed. I looked at the 1895 deed, now displayed in a bulletproof glass case in the main hall, and I felt my father's spirit finally at peace. The quiet kid with the dusty maps had become the most powerful land guardian in the country, and the greedy uncle who tried to bury him was now nothing but a cautionary tale in a history book. I closed the heavy oak doors of the library, not to hide from the world, but to welcome the new generation of stewards who were ready to carry on the fight. The war for Sterling Manor was over, the loophole had changed the world, and the nobody nephew was the only one left standing on the hill. The fall of the silver hand didn't happen with a single explosion, but with a slow, agonizing digital bleed that I personally orchestrated from the high-security library of Sterling Manor, watching on my monitors as $5 trillion empires began to crumble under the weight of their own historic crimes. After rejecting Julian Vane's billion-dollar bribe, I knew that the syndicate would try to use their global influence to bury the Sterling Institute before it even started. But they forgot that I now held the master decryption keys to every land grab they had committed since the turn of the century. I spent the next 6 months working 18 hours a day, turning my father's quiet library into a global command center for sovereign justice. I didn't just leak the files to the news. I used my specialized training in historical cartography to create an interactive digital map of corruption that showed exactly how these 5 families had stolen ancestral lands in Australia, the UK, Canada, and the USA to build their private tax havens. The world watched in absolute shock as I revealed that the Silver Hand wasn't just a development firm. They were a parasitic ghost entity that had been sucking the life out of local communities for generations. One by one, the 5 families were hit with sovereign reversion orders that I had drafted in coordination with the International Criminal Court. I watched through live satellite feeds as their private islands were seized, their luxury yachts were impounded, and their secret alpine bunkers were raided by special task forces. The trillionaire elite, who once thought they were gods above the law, were now being dragged out of their penthouses in handcuffs, their faces blurred by the same news cameras they once used to buy their public image. While the global reckoning was happening, I decided it was time to close the final chapter on the man who had started it all, my Uncle Arthur. I used my power as the sovereign steward to authorize a historical audit of the prison where Arthur was serving his life sentence. I discovered that the prison itself was built on land that the Silver Hand had illegally seized from a local tribe in the 1950s. Using my legal loophole, I forced the state to return the land to its rightful owners, which meant the prison had to be decommissioned, and the inmates moved to a much older, much more brutal high-security facility in the frozen Northern Territory. Arthur, who had been trying to use his last remaining connections to get a comfortable luxury cell, was instead loaded onto a transport bus in the middle of a blizzard, chained to a group of violent criminals who had no respect for his sterling name. I watched the dashcam footage of that bus ride, seeing Arthur's face pressed against the cold glass, realized that he was being moved to a place where his suits, his scotch, and his forged wills meant absolutely nothing. He was no longer a sterling. He was just inmate 7742, a man who would spend the rest of his days mopping the floors of a concrete tomb. Back at the manor, the Sterling Global Institute of Land Sovereignty had become the most important legal hub on the planet. I was no longer a nobody nephew. I was the man who had rewritten the rules of property ownership for the modern age. I spent my afternoons walking through the manor's gardens, which were now open to the public. Watching young students from all over the world learn how to use history as a shield against greed. But there was one final secret I had to uncover, the founder's chamber that my father had mentioned in his final letter. I returned to the library, used the 1895 master key to open a hidden compartment under the main floorboards, and found a second leather tube. Inside was not another map, but a series of handwritten journals from my great-great-grandfather, the man who had originally created the Sovereign Trust. As I read the pages, I realized that the Sterling family hadn't just been landowners. They were the secret keepers of a global network of sacred stewardship. The journal revealed that there were dozens of other estates like Sterling Manor all over the world, each one protected by the same 100-year-old loopholes, waiting for a master steward to wake them up. I realized that my war with Arthur and the Silver Hand was just the first battle in a much larger global struggle. My father hadn't just trained me to save our home. He had trained me to lead a worldwide movement to reclaim the earth from the hands of the corrupt. I stood on the balcony of the manor, the cool night air hitting my face, and looked out at the glowing lights of the city below. I felt a deep, unbreakable connection to the land, the air, and the history that flowed through my veins. The nobody nephew had become the guardian of the world's legacy. I pulled out my phone and sent a single encrypted message to a group of young archivists I had been training in secret in London, Sydney, and Toronto. The message simply said, "The Sovereign Protocol is active. Begin the audit." Within seconds, I saw the digital pings of 1,000 new investigations starting all over the globe. The age of the billionaire land grabber was officially over, and the age of the steward had begun. I walked back into the library, the heavy oak doors closing with a sound of absolute finality. I wasn't just home. I was the architect of a new future where the past could never be stolen again. The war for Sterling Manor had ended, but the mission of the Sterling Institute would never sleep. The world thought the war for the Sterling estate was over when the silver hand leaders were led away in handcuffs. But as a master of land stewardship, I knew that a trillion-dollar snake doesn't just die. It fragments into smaller, more venomous pieces that hide in the tall grass waiting for the perfect moment to strike. While the Sterling Global Institute was busy auditing land grabs across Europe and Asia, a new shadow began to creep over our ancestral forest. A shadow that didn't come with legal papers or corporate SUVs, but with the silent, deadly precision of a ghost. This was Valerius Vane, the Ivy League-educated, Black Ops-trained son of Julian Vane, who had watched his father's career and the syndicate's fortune evaporate because of my 100-year-old maps. Valerius didn't want a bribe, and he didn't want the land. He wanted the total, absolute annihilation of the sovereign sanctuary status that protected the Sterling Woods. On a moonless Tuesday night, exactly 7 months after the global audit began, my perimeter thermal sensors, the ones I had integrated into the root systems of the ancient oaks, began picking up a strange, chemical heat signature near the mouth of the primary aquifer. I sat in my command center, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off my face, and watched as a group of 4 men in high-end hazmat suits moved through the darkness like shadows. They weren't carrying guns. They were carrying pressurized canisters of a synthetic, untraceable neurotoxin specifically designed to poison the water table and kill off the rare white owls. Valerius's plan was brilliantly evil. If he could prove that the Sterling land was an ecological dead zone, the sovereign sanctuary status would be legally revoked under the 1899 Hydrology Act, and the land would revert to a brownfield industrial site, allowing the remnants of the syndicate to buy it back for pennies. I didn't call the police, because I knew Valerius had already jammed the satellite signals, and I didn't rush out there with a weapon, because I was a steward of the land, not a soldier. I simply engaged the Sovereign Hydraulic Diverter, a mechanical system I had discovered in the 1895 blueprints that allowed the master steward to manually reroute the underground aquifer into a series of ancient, stone-lined filtration chambers. As the eco-terrorists began pumping their poison into what they thought was the main water supply, they had no idea they were actually filling a sealed, subterranean stone tank that had been built for exactly this kind of emergency a century ago. I watched through the night vision cameras as Valerius himself stepped out from behind a tree, removing his mask and looking at the manor with a smile of pure, psychopathic satisfaction, convinced he had just poisoned the future of my family. I waited until the canisters were empty, and then I triggered the second phase of the 1895 defense protocol, the acoustic disorientation grid. Hidden within the hollowed trunks of the old-growth oaks were a series of high-frequency steam whistles that used the manor's original geothermal pressure. I activated the system, and suddenly, the quiet forest was filled with a deafening, subsonic roar that vibrated the very bones of the intruders, making it impossible for them to stand or speak. While they were collapsed on the forest floor, clutching their ears in agony, I stepped out onto the balcony and spoke into the long-range megaphone system. I told Valerius that he was currently trespassing on sacred sovereign soil, and that his attempt to poison the aquifer had just been recorded by 12 different multispectral sensors that were linked directly to the International Environmental Court. I told him that the toxic liquid he just pumped into the ground was currently being analyzed by an automated lab, and that the results were already being uploaded to a blockchain-based evidence locker that no one in the silver hand could ever delete. The look of pure, agonizing shock on Valerius's face when he realized his brilliant plan had been anticipated by a 100-year-old mechanical system was the final victory of the Sterling legacy. He tried to run, but I had already triggered the automated marsh traps, areas of the forest floor where the soil was intentionally kept soft and saturated using the diverted water. Valerius and his team sank waist-deep into the thick, sovereign mud, trapped in the very earth they tried to destroy. I didn't leave them there to die. I waited until the state environmental police, whom I had alerted via a pre-programmed emergency frequency that bypassed his jammers, arrived on the scene with their high-intensity searchlights. As Valerius was being pulled out of the mud in handcuffs, his expensive gear covered in the dirt of the land he despised, I walked down the hill and stood directly in front of him. I didn't say anything about his father, and I didn't mention the billion-dollar bribe. I simply handed him a small, white feather from one of the rare owls that had just landed on a nearby branch. I told him that the land remembers everything, and today it had decided to testify against him. With Valerius Vane finally in custody, the last shadow of the syndicate was officially removed. The Sterling Global Institute wasn't just a research center anymore. It was now a global, eco-sovereign power, recognized by the United Nations as a model for land protection. I returned to the manor, the heavy oak doors closing with a sound that felt like a heartbeat. I walked into my father's library, looked at the 1895 map one last time, and realized that my journey from a nobody nephew to the guardian of the earth was finally complete. I had used the past to protect the future, and I had turned a family tragedy into a global triumph. The war for the Sterling estate was truly, finally, and victoriously over. The rare white owls continued to hoot in the trees, the aquifer continued to flow with pure, life-giving water, and the name Sterling was now etched in the history books as the name of the family that refused to let the world be stolen. I sat down at my father's desk, closed my eyes, and for the first time in 5 long years, I slept with a heart that was completely at peace. The nobody had become the master, and the master had become the land. The heavy, solid bronze doors of the International Tribunal of Land Sovereignty swung open with a sound that felt like the gears of fate finally locking into place. And as I walked into that massive, circular courtroom in The Hague, I realized that my fight for a $50 million estate had officially transformed into a war for the very soul of the planet's land laws. I was no longer the nobody nephew hiding in a basement archive. I was the primary witness and the lead sovereign steward in a case that was being broadcast live to over 2 billion people across every continent. Sitting in the defendant's box was a sight that most people thought was impossible. The entire leadership of the Silver Hand, along with Marcus Thon, Senator Graves, Julian Vane, and his son Valerius, all shackled in high-security chains and surrounded by an army of 100 elite corporate lawyers who were being paid $1 million an hour to try and find a way to kill the 1895 sovereign land grant. The air in the courtroom was thick with the scent of old wood, expensive perfume, and the cold, electric tension of a world about to change forever. I took my seat at the witness stand, looking directly into the eyes of the 5 judges, the most respected legal minds from the USA, Australia, the UK, France, and Japan, and I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. The lead defense attorney, a man named Sterling Vance, no relation to my family, though he tried to claim it, stood up and spent the first 4 hours of the trial trying to argue that the 1895 law was a historical relic that had no place in a modern, globalized economy. He called me a digital terrorist and a legal scavenger who was using outdated loopholes to steal back land that had been rightfully developed by his billionaire clients. He tried to paint the Silver Hand as the heroes of progress and me as the villain who wanted to drag the world back into the Dark Ages. But I didn't get angry, and I didn't interrupt. I waited until he was completely finished, until he sat down with a smug, arrogant smile, convinced he had just won the case for the elite. Then, I stood up and pulled out the original 1902 master survey map, the one I had rescued from the archives. I didn't just show them the map. I activated the manor's remote satellite link and projected a 3D holographic overlay of the Sterling Aquifer and the global, sovereign network I had discovered in my great-great-grandfather's journals. I showed the judges, and the world, that these outdated laws weren't relics. They were the original, unbreakable safeguards designed to protect the Earth's most precious resources from the exact kind of parasitic greed that was sitting in the defendant's box. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously presenting the digital evidence I had siphoned from the syndicate's Swiss servers, showing the secret contracts for land grabs on every continent, the records of bribed politicians, and the literal price tags they had placed on the world's natural wonders. Every time I revealed a new file, the room went dead silent, and the corporate lawyers at the defense table began frantically whispering and sweating through their designer shirts. I showed the live feed of the rare white owls nesting in the Sterling Oaks, their existence a living testimony to the success of the Sovereign Trust. By the time the sun began to set on the third day of the trial, the defense had completely collapsed. The lawyers realized that no amount of money could rewrite the 1895 law, and no amount of influence could delete the truth once it was in the public domain. The chief judge, a woman with a voice like a landslide, stood up and began reading the final verdict, and it was a total, absolute annihilation of the Silver Hands Empire. The syndicate was officially declared a criminal sovereign threat, and every single one of their assets, trillions of dollars in land, gold, and digital currency, was ordered to be seized and placed into a global sovereign trust managed by the Sterling Institute. Senator Graves was sentenced to 50 years for high treason and bribery. Marcus Thon was given life for his role in the corporate conspiracy, and Julian and Valerius Vane were sentenced to 80 years each in the same high-security Arctic prison, where my uncle Arthur was currently rotting. Speaking of Arthur, the judge added a special clause to his sentence, stripping him of any right to use the Sterling name ever again, legally erasing him from the family tree he tried to burn down. As the guards led the villains away in their chains, Julian Vane stopped and looked at me one last time, his eyes full of a dark, hollow madness, realized that he had been defeated not by a richer man, but by a better man with a longer memory. I walked out of the courtroom and onto the Grand Plaza of The Hague, where a crowd of tens of thousands of people had gathered to celebrate. They weren't just cheering for me, they were cheering for the idea that the land finally belonged to the people again. I returned to Stirling Manor a week later, and for the first time in 5 long years, I didn't look at the maps to find a weapon. I looked at them to find a plan for peace. I spent the afternoon sitting on the porch with Silas, the old archivist, who had finally retired from the bureau to become the head of history at the Sterling Institute. We watched as the first class of global stewards, young men and women from every nation, began their orientation under the ancient oaks. I realized that my father's dream hadn't just been saved, it had been magnified 1,000 times over. The nobody nephew had become the guardian of the world's heritage, and the Sterling name was now a beacon of hope for everyone who had ever been told that they were too small to fight the system. I walked into the library, touched the cool stone of the 1895 vault, and felt a deep, warm sense of completion. The war was truly over, the loopholes had served their purpose, and the truth was now the supreme law of the land. I sat down at my father's desk, opened a new, blank journal, and began to write the first page of the future. I knew that there would always be new bullies and new syndicates, but I also knew that as long as there were stewards willing to remember the past, the world would never be truly lost. The owls hooted in the distance, the water flowed pure in the aquifer, and the land was finally at rest. The heavy, rhythmic ticking of the antique brass clock in the grand library of Stirling Manor no longer sounded like a countdown to disaster. It sounded like the steady, unbreakable heartbeat of a legacy that had survived the fires of greed and emerged as the strongest legal force on the planet. 5 years had passed since the International Tribunal at The Hague dismantled the Silver Hand, and as I stood on the balcony overlooking the vast, emerald-green Sterling forest, I realized that the $50 million inheritance I once fought for was now the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar global trust that protected the rights of the common person in over 50 different countries. The rare white owls were no longer just birds. They were the living symbols of the sovereign era, their hooting at night a constant reminder that the land was finally at peace under the watch of a master steward. I spent my mornings in the founder's chamber, the secret room my father had built behind the fireplace, which was now filled with the digital and physical archives of every major land grab we had reversed since the trial. I wasn't just a nephew who got lucky with a loophole. I was the architect of a new world order where history was the ultimate weapon against corporate corruption. My life was now a blur of high-stakes meetings with world leaders, keynote speeches at global environmental summits, and the quiet, intense study of ancient maps that continued to arrive from every corner of the earth. But today was a different kind of day. It was the day I received the final status report on the people who tried to ruin me. I sat down at my father's desk, the cool leather chair feeling like a throne of justice, and opened the encrypted file on my tablet. The first name on the list was Senator William Graves. After losing his power and his reputation, he had been moved to a low-security medical ward in a federal prison after suffering a series of strokes. He spent his days staring at a blank wall, unable to speak, his only company being the ghosts of the people he had betrayed for bribe money. Marcus Thon, the man who thought he could buy the state, was currently serving his life sentence in a maximum security facility, where he was assigned to the kitchen crew, peeling potatoes for 18 hours a day in a humid, windowless room, a far cry from the luxury penthouses and private jets he once called home. The Vane family, Julian and Valerius, had been stripped of every single cent of their stolen trillions and were being held in separate isolation units in the Arctic prison, their names officially erased from the legal registry of the world. But it was the report on Uncle Arthur that made me pause. Arthur had spent the last 5 years in total, absolute zillat, the word for a humiliation so deep it burns the soul. After being stripped of the sterling name and his inheritance, he had become a pariah even among the prison population. He had tried to write me letters every week, begging for a single dollar or a word of forgiveness, claiming that he was old and sick, and that family should stick together. I didn't open a single one of those letters. Instead, I had them all digitally scanned and added to the archives of betrayal as a case study for future stewards on the psychology of greed. The final report stated that Arthur had passed away in his sleep just 48 hours ago, alone in a concrete cell that smelled of bleach and despair. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, his existence officially concluded without a single friend, a single family member, or a single cent to mark his passing. He died as a nobody, exactly as he had once predicted I would. I closed the tablet, feeling a sense of cold finality that settled deep in my chest. The war was over, the villains were gone, and the sterling name was now synonymous with unbreakable integrity. But then, Silas, the old archivist who was now 85 and still as sharp as a razor, walked into the library carrying a small, silver box I had never seen before. He told me that my father had left one final instruction, a secret that could only be revealed if I successfully managed to maintain the stewardship for 5 full years. My hands trembled as I opened the box and found a series of photographs and a letter dated 20 years ago. As I read the words, my entire reality shifted once again. My father hadn't just discovered the 1895 loophole. He had spent his entire life creating the conditions for it to be discovered by me. He revealed in the letter that he knew Arthur would eventually try to steal the estate, and he had intentionally worked with Justice Thorne to plant the master steward clause into the 1895 land grant through a series of complex, long-game legal maneuvers that spanned 3 decades. He had trained me to be a land archivist, not because it was a niche hobby, but because it was the only way I could ever trigger the defense system he had built for me. I realized that my father was the ultimate master steward, a man who had sacrificed his own peace of mind to ensure that I would one day have the power to change the world. He told me in the letter that the Sterling estate was never just a home. It was a seed of justice, planted in the heart of a corrupt world, waiting for someone with the courage to water it with the truth. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the thousands of acres of Sterling land, feeling a connection to my father that was stronger than anything I had ever felt while he was alive. I wasn't just a hero who found a loophole. I was the culmination of a 30-year master plan to destroy the silver hand and reclaim the planet for the honest people who lived on it. I turned to Silas and told him that the Sterling Global Institute was no longer just about land. It was about the sovereign rights of the human spirit. We began the process of expanding our audit to include digital rights, medical patents, and educational access, using the same sovereign stewardship model to ensure that no corporation could ever again own the future of a child. I spent the rest of my days as the most powerful nobody in the world, a man who lived in a quiet manner but whose voice could crash a stock market or topple a corrupt government with a single digital leak. I never married, and I never had children of my own, but I had thousands of stewards all over the planet who called me their mentor. I had turned a family tragedy into a global triumph, and I had proven that the quiet kid with the dusty maps was the only one who truly knew the value of the ground we stand on. As the sun set on the final day of the 5th year, I walked down to the aquifer, took a sip of the pure, life-giving water, and watched the white owls take flight into the night. The story of the Sterling estate was no longer a secret. It was a legend, a